Good morning, church. How are we doing today? I just want to start by thanking Lisa Mason for probably one of the most beautiful communion messages I've ever heard. Of course, this was her first time getting up here and doing this without Joe, and it was very brave and unbelievable, and thank you so much, Lisa. This year we're studying out this concept of becoming for the entire year, coming from John 3:30, where John the Baptist states that he must become less and Jesus must become more. And we are looking at that verse through the entirety of the year and how in our own lives we can make Jesus more while self becomes less. And so we've done a series of sermons and lessons around that theme. And this month we've been studying out the concept of discipleship, this idea of what does it mean to walk with Jesus, as that helps us to become less and him to become more. I turned 50 this year. In a couple months, I turned 50 years old, and that's a milestone. I don't really go in for that all that much, but that feels old to me. That sounds old. 50 sounds old. Like when you tell young people you're 50, you're like in another category now. You're living in another stratosphere. You're like your good years are behind you in their minds, and I don't know why young people think that way. I don't think it's true. But you think about your life, you think about all that you've done, and you're rounding things out in some ways, I've given my life, my entire life, to this church, to being in the ministry, to doing this work, and it's impossible not to think about, has it meant anything? Have I made any difference? And when I became a Christian, I was in college. I was 19 years old, and at the time, all right, trying to imagine this, I have very long hair. I play in a rock band, so on the weekends I play house parties and stuff like that with the band that I was in. I didn't even want to go to college. My plan was to drop out of high school and join the Peace Corps, and I wanted to go change the world. I wanted to I wanted to build irrigation canals in Ecuador. I wanted to move to Northern Ireland and free them from the oppression of the United Kingdom and England. And I wanted to overturn oppression. I mean, that was I spent my weekends just working in homeless shelters, and I was very passionate about all of that. And I still feel very strongly about those things as well. But I studied the Bible, and it wasn't a choice of mine. I had to do it, or my girlfriend at the time was going to break up with me. She's my wife now, so that worked out. But I was forced to study the Bible, and I did not want to. And in the course of studying the Bible, you become attached to this Jesus revolution, to this idea of changing the world by walking with Jesus, by following him. And so I came into this mission with all of the passion and all of what I felt, and I put all of that into following Jesus. But here's the thing, I was still the same guy, okay? I was still cynical, and I was negative, and I was angry, and I still have all of that. And I'm like, we're gonna change the world for Jesus, but not with a smile, and that's how I came into things. All right, go ahead and open your Bibles to Numbers chapter 21. And I want to talk about transformation today and the idea that Jesus in your life over time changes you, turns you, makes you something other than what you were when you began. There's this area of the country, I don't know if you've ever heard of it it's called the Driftless. It's this area of the country, it's like in the corner of 4 states, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Iowa. And it's this very identifiable area of the country, and it's filled with bluffs and canyons and very cold water rivers. It looks nothing like the Midwest. And they call it the Driftless because it's the only area of our country in that part of our geography that was not covered by glaciers during the last ice age. And so, most of the Midwest is flat, okay? The glaciers went over this area of our country. It created new features, and then as they retreated, it left behind remnants of the glacier, drift, okay? But in this small area right here, the glaciers never, for whatever reason, never came to this area. It's about thousands of miles of square miles. So it looks different. It has no drift in it. The glaciers never transformed the land there, and it's called the driftless area of the country. It remains untransformed by the glacier. And I think about that sometimes in becoming like Jesus, because over the course of my decades of trying to do that, there still remains these driftless areas of my life that Jesus has not come over yet, that Jesus has not yet transformed. And I think about, like, why does that happen? Why are there still areas of life after decades of doing this that Jesus has not yet transformed? And there's no one answer to that question, of course, but for my life and for the lives of many people that I see, I think there's a distinct pattern that results in many arenas of our lives that remain driftless and unformed for a reason. And I think it has to do with how the vestiges of unbelief still show up in the way that we live and the way that we interact with the world around us. And these vestiges are clues to the notion of why we still haven't put our full trust in Jesus yet. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about these clues and how they actually manifest in our lives and what the Bible teaches us we have to do about them. You know, in Numbers chapter 21, we're getting to a time, really just before the Israelites are about to enter the Promised Land. And the Israelites they're not a warrior people. They were people who were slaves for 400 years. Their skills are pretty much mired in that little scope of what they were forced to do in labor. All right, so they don't have weapons. They don't know how to start a nation. They're being guided by some guy they never met before who brought them out of Egypt. And they're often hungry. They're often thirsty. They're often scared. They don't know what enemies are around them or when enemies around them are going to attack. They're constantly in fear for their families. And like I said, they've got this guy, Moses, who said, God sent me to lead you, but they don't know Moses. And so they're putting a lot of trust in this guy who used to be royalty, but then was kicked out and now has come back and somehow is their leader. And then they're told about this God that is going to lead them, and this God that is huge and somewhat terrifying. And this is a people that is living pretty much in constant fear and discomfort. And all of this fear and unease and discomfort and the unsettling reality of not knowing what the next day would bring often resolved into what the Bible calls grumbling. All right, where in all of the anxiety, it spills out in negativity, and it spills out in complaining, and the fear drives them into cynicism, into cynical discussion. And, when we get to Numbers chapter 21, it starts in verse 1. When the Canaanite king of Arad, who lived in the Negev, heard that Israel was coming along the road to Tharim, he attacked the Israelites and captured some of them. Then Israel made this vow to the Lord: if you will deliver these people into our hands, we will totally destroy their cities. The Lord listened to Israel's plea and gave the Canaanites over to them. They completely destroyed them and their towns, so the place was called Hormah. So this story is setting up what's about to take place, okay? And it's typical where the Israelites are in need. Their enemies have come, kidnapped some of their own family, their neighbors. And they pray to God, if we attack them, we will trust you, and we will destroy everything that you tell us to. So, and these aren't warriors, these are not seasoned veterans, but they go and they attack this much more seasoned and hardened enemy, and God helps them overcome. And they get their families back, and they destroy the cities, and prayers answered. Okay? That is the setup of the story. We go in verse 4. They traveled from Mount Hor along the route to the Red Sea. to go around Edom. But the people grew impatient on the way. They spoke against God and they spoke against Moses and said, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There is no bread, there is no water, and we detest this miserable food." Then the Lord sent venomous snakes among them. They bit the people, and many Israelites died. The people came to Moses and said, "We sinned when we spoke against the Lord and against you. Pray that the Lord will take the snakes away from us." So Moses prayed for the people. Now I want to look at a couple important pieces of context in addition to the fact that God just helped them overcome an army, okay? This story takes place right after Aaron, the high priest, has died. And that's important because that marks in time how long it's been since they've left Egypt. All right, so Aaron died 40 years after they left Egypt. All right, now they're complaining about, why did you bring us up out of Egypt? And so in those 40 years, they've now romanticized their view of what Egypt was. Keep in mind, they were slaves for 400 years. Okay, and in 40 years of discomfort, they have now romanticized that past. All right, we used to have food that we liked there. You know, now they're complaining about the food. This bears mentioning, God miraculously provides them with food every single day for 40 years. All right, that's the food that they're complaining about. All right, and they're nearing the end. Now, they're in the desert because their parents were faithless to God. Their parents would not trust God. God was bringing them around a dangerous route, and the people would not trust God. And this is after 2 years of near constant complaining against God. And God said, "That's fine. This generation, you're going to die in the desert. You're going to wander for 40 years. Your children will inherit the promised land, but you will not." And what has happened in those 40 years altogether? Well, God sent the plagues to Egypt. He freed them from slavery. He split a sea so they could escape safely. He then drowned the Egyptian army that was chasing them with that same sea. He fed them every day with this miraculous manna. He brought water out of rocks so they wouldn't go thirsty. He just destroyed another army for them, all right? And he leads them, and this is what's crazy, for 40 years, every single day, he leads them with a column of cloud that's either resting on their tabernacle, if they're staying, or is moving and they're following behind it. And then when the sun sets, that pillar of cloud turns into a column of fire every day for 40 years. It's amazing the blessings that we get used to. Like, we look at that and we're like, how could they ever be faithless? I'm positive if someone told the story of your life and all the visible things that God has done for you, they would go, how could you ever be faithless? All right, all of this has happened, and still the Israelites complain because they don't trust God. 40 years of walking literally with God through the desert still left driftless places in their hearts. They still struggled at times to really believe, actually believe, despite all of the evidence that's being presented to them. I think both belief and the lack of belief have very specific expressions in our life. Believers, true believers, they more easily trust. They more easily hope. Those who struggle to believe are more given over to negativity, to complaining, and to mistrust. In this moment, their lack of belief resulted in bitter complaining once again. And this is one of those clues I was talking about the driftless areas of our lives. The negativity, the complaining, and the mistrust are clues that we still don't fully believe God. We don't fully trust him. Now, as a consequence of this, God does something interesting to the Israelites. He sends poisonous snakes amongst them. In Jewish tradition, they look at this story and describe the punishment that God gives the Israelites, the snakes, as something called a measure for measure. Basically, the punishment fits the crime. All right? So the words of the mistrusting Israelites and their complaints were considered poisonous. This is how a lot of ancient Jewish scholars would have described the Israelites at this point. Their negativity, their complaining, their mistrust is a poison. And so God sent poison to them. All right? And it's a kind of poison that spreads to everyone in the same way that complaining does. So God sent snakes which crawl around silently on their bellies with forked tongues mirroring the forked tongues of those that speak out in complaint against God and against his plans. The snakes spread their poison, killing many people. It's poison for poison. The Israelites were negative. They were complaining. They were argumentative. They did not trust God. They did not trust Moses. And that kind of culture is lazy. It's easy. It's deeply contagious. It's way easier to be negative than it is to be positive. It's way easier to be cynical than it is to be hopeful. It's so much easier to mistrust rather than to trust. And Christians should seek to do the latter rather than the former, but sometimes we are no better than the Israelites, and we have so much less at stake than they did. We are safer than they were. We are more comfortable than they are. We are way more blessed than they were. Yet we can grumble and complain more than they did. We too can be poisonous. You know, there's a lot of studies that's been done on the concept of negativity, psychological studies, and its impact on groups. There are studies that show one negative person in a large group in a work area can have an outsized impact on the group itself. And they can show this through a myriad of proofs over and over and over again. You know, a negative person's impact spreads to other people, making more people negative. All right? There are studies that show that outrage and negativity spread way faster online than positivity does. All right? Other studies show that lies travel faster online than truth travels. All right, there was an MIT study that analyzed 126,000 news stories tweeted by 3 million people over 10 years. So a very comprehensive and long-range study. And what they found is that false news studies were 70% more likely to be retweeted than true ones. So a lie that would be tweeted reaches 1,500 people 6 times faster than something that's tweeted that's true. False political news spreads the fastest compared to other categories. All right, now I'm somewhat belaboring this point, okay, about poison for poison. But I think it's important that we see ourselves in these ancient stories. 40 years of wandering still left this part of the Israelites untransformed. This negativity, this propensity not to trust God, this tendency to see what is bad rather than what is possible, was abhorrent to God. It was evidence that there was still a driftless aspect to the human landscape within the Israelites. But God doesn't send merely consequences. All right? He sends consequences with a cure. In verse 8 of Numbers 21, it says, "The Lord said to Moses, 'Make a snake, put it on a pole, and anyone who is bitten can look at it and live.' So Moses made a bronze snake, put it on a pole. Then when anyone was bitten by a snake and looked at the bronze snake, they lived." It's such a bizarre story for us. So God sends the snakes, but right away with the snakes, he sends a cure as well. The only way to cure the poison from the snake bite was to do something that was the opposite of the poison, which meant they had to trust. They had to look at what God put before them as his plan and then trust him. And they had to believe. And they were transformed from a person that was poisoned to a person that was clean simply by believing. Go ahead and turn to John chapter 3. Now, the whole point of me telling this story is because I think this is how discipleship actually works. We all have these driftless areas of our lives, these areas of our lives that remain untransformed. Sometimes even after decades of following God through the wilderness, we still don't believe. And that lack of belief shows up in our lives, oftentimes as negativity, as complaining, or as cynicism. To be honest, I think that we as a people, as a faith community, we still grumble too much. Our instinct too often when things go wrong is to be negative. Negative about the world, negative about work, negative about our neighbors, negative about our loved ones, negative about the future. We are poisoned, and our instinct is to poison others. There are plenty other areas that may remain untethered to God's sovereignty as well in our lives. They can only be healed if we look at Jesus, though. In John chapter 3, there's it's just this great interaction between a man named Nicodemus and Jesus. And Nicodemus is this scholar, very respected, very influential. And, we don't really know what his connection to Jesus is before this moment, but clearly he's been listening. He's been hearing things that Jesus has said, or he's heard things that Jesus has said. And he wants to meet the man. All right? He wants to talk. There's something within him that's like, I gotta talk to this guy. But I don't want to be seen talking to this guy. Okay? So he goes to Jesus at night so he can have a conversation without the fear of being associated with Jesus. And in verse 1 it says, "Now there was a Pharisee, a man named Nicodemus, who was a member of the Jewish ruling council. He came to Jesus at night and said, 'Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher who has come to God, for no one could perform the signs you are doing if God were not with him.' Jesus replied, 'Very truly I tell you, no one can see the kingdom of God unless they are born again.'" It's unfair with Jesus, because when someone comes to us and they say something, and we're like, I feel like you're telling me one thing, but this is about something else, and then we have to spend a lot of time trying to figure out what that is. Jesus knew already. So Nicodemus begins with the flattery, and then Jesus cuts right to the heart of things. He says, "You cannot enter the kingdom of God unless you are born again." Right? No, good to see ya. Thank you very much for those kind words. Nothing like that. Just straight to, I know why you're here. "How can someone be born when they are old?" Nicodemus asked. "Surely they cannot enter a second time into their mother's womb to be born." Nicodemus, I believe Nicodemus knows something's wrong. I don't know how old Nicodemus was. Let's just say he was my age. Old. All right, and he's coming to Jesus, and he's looking back on his life, and he goes, I feel like something's wrong. He doesn't want to say that. He doesn't want to admit that. He's going to play his cards close to his chest. But he knows it. He feels like something's off. He knows that his world could be a little bit off kilter. He knows, but he doesn't want to openly resist or question the order of things. All right? So he comes to Jesus at night, and he hopes for an answer that satisfies him but does not disrupt him. And how often do we do that? We make a phone call, and we just want some reassurance, and we don't get reassurance. Discipleship brings us disruption. We look to Jesus, and we just want to feel better, and he disrupts our lives. He wants assurances, but he doesn't want to have to risk anything for the assurances that Jesus has. And he's cynical. He's willfully misunderstanding Jesus during the conversation because he's a doubter and because he's scared. It's a very human interaction. And it's an interaction that highlights our propensity to doubt God and not to trust in him. One of the things I've sought to understand better this year is, what is the gospel? I thought, there was one day I was sitting around, and if someone said, "Hey, just in 2 sentences, tell me what the gospel is," I would be a little bit like, oh. And I'm like, I've been a minister for 30 years, and I'm struggling with this question. And so I've been just studying like what is the good news? Like when they talk about the good news, what is it that they're talking? Would my answer align biblically? And more importantly, do I actually believe the good news? And I mean, of course I believe it, right? But do I believe the gospel enough that news doesn't bother me? Do I believe the gospel enough not to live my life in worry? Do I believe it to the extent that the gospel brings me joy even as circumstances may not be at their best in a given moment? Belief just isn't that easy, I'm finding. Trusting the gospel, trusting in Jesus is hard. It's hard to believe this. It's hard to believe what you cannot see. But I want to believe. I want to believe. I want to be able to believe so much that every piece of bad news washes over me like an inconsequential breath of bad air. I want to believe so much that there are no words that a person could say that would make me dislike them all that much. I want to believe in Jesus to the point where the mere honor of following him makes every other offer in this world seem boring and prosaic. And that was one of the problems with Nicodemus. There was something about Jesus he must have liked. There had to be. He came to him. There's something about him he actually liked, he desired. He wanted to understand why Jesus made him think that perhaps not everything was as it seems. He was hoping to be reassured, and instead Jesus told him that he needed to leave everything he had built in this world of doubt, of fault-finding, and of influence. And he needed to be a believer and not a cynic that simply scorned the world and scorned the world around him, the people around him. Jesus was telling Nicodemus he needed to look elsewhere to cure all the poison in the world. And he wasn't going to find it in his books, he wasn't going to find it in his debates, and he wasn't going to find it in his high tower. He goes on in verse 10 of chapter 3, "You are Israel's teacher," said Jesus, "and you do not understand these things? Very truly, I tell you, we speak of what we know, and we testify to what we have seen. But still, you people do not accept our testimony. I have spoken to you of earthly things, and you don't believe. How then will you believe when I speak to you of heavenly things? No one has ever gone into heaven except for the one that came from heaven, the Son of Man. And just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up, that everyone who believes may have eternal life in him." You know, belief isn't yes or no. It just isn't. It begins so quietly. It begins so faintly, and it grows strong. But it has to be nurtured. It needs good soil to grow. Belief needs good, fertile soil to grow. But it will grow under those good conditions. Perhaps slower than we'd like, but it will be relentless in its growth. You know, there are ways of living that kill belief, no doubt about it. A life of sin will quench belief, sure, yeah. But I think a far more effective way to squash belief is what so many of us do. We surround ourselves with the voices and the messages that undermine belief, that mock belief, that sabotage belief far more effectively than sin ever will. At least sin points us back to our need to God. Too many Christians let the voices of this world drown out the words of Jesus. And as a result, they're negative. They're cynical. They're mean. They're contrary to nearly everything and everybody. They don't see neighbors as friends anymore. What they see is enemies and spies and adversaries everywhere. That's the desert filled with venomous snakes. And if you're tired of all the poison, if you're weary of all the hatred and the negativity, then look to Jesus. The voice we need to overwhelmingly hear is that of Jesus. Jesus really does heal what poisons. You have to believe him, of course, and then you have to walk with him and walk like him, and he will transform you. You know, last weekend we had a bunch of the young professionals over at our house on Saturday night. And, you know, at the end of the night, we got to talking about movies. And I was listening to the movies that they like to watch, and some of them like horror movies, you know, and which I don't particularly like because of the great indignity of jump scares. I don't want to sit there and like jump, and I feel completely unmanned by it all, and so I don't like horror movies. And then some of them, they like the movies with like all the human drama, the tragedy and the sadness, real life stuff. And, you know, I go to movies to get away from all of that. You know what I mean? Like, I don't want to see that in the movie. I'm feeling that from day to day. I don't want to pay money to feel it in a movie. You know what movies I like? I like movies where the audience cheers during the movie. I literally will watch YouTube videos of moments where the audience gets so fired up they start cheering during the movie. Those are the movies I like. I like corny movies. I like happy ending movies. I want heroes and I want courage, and I want movies where the good guys win. All right? You know, my wife, she makes fun of me because I like to think of myself as a cynic and talk about myself as being cynical. And my wife thinks I'm actually hopelessly positive. She actually thinks I'm quite naive. And the thing is, I'm realizing as I'm approaching 50 that I am. Like, I am. She's coming to my office at times, and you know, she'll catch me watching videos of veterans coming home and surprising their families. Or long-lost friends just showing up. You know, someone rescuing. That's what I want to watch. I'm positive, that's it. You know, I'm not going to say I'm cynical anymore. It sounds so cool and romantic to say it. But I'm not. You know, I wasn't all that positive when I was younger. Stepping into this faith, stepping into this life, I wasn't positive. I came into it angry. I came into it and I saw the church and I was like, this is an army to take over the world and change it. And now I don't. I see it as like we're a family throwing a block party where other people can come if they want to. As I've gotten older, I've started to realize that in order to really be helpful with people, in order to really be a trustworthy person, and in order to be worthy of being called a city on a hill, then I've needed to shed my cynicism and grow up. In order to point people to Jesus, you actually have to like people. You have to believe in people. You have to be willing to trust people. You know, over the summer, there's a movie that came out that I really liked, and my boys really liked it. And because my boys really liked it, it made me like it even more. And the movie is Superman. And I'm kind of disenfranchised with all the superhero movies, but I really like this movie. And there's this scene in this movie, and you know, in the movie Superman, I'm not going to give away the ending or anything, but he's gotten a ton of negative publicity. Like, he's very much disliked at this moment. And he's sitting with Lois Lane, and he's kind of depressed, and he's about to turn himself in to the authorities because, you know, like, no one trusts him anymore. And him and Lois Lane got into a fight the previous day. Anyway, and they're talking, and Lois Lane is like, they're talking about their last fight, and Lois Lane's like, well, we're gonna fight. We're just so different. And she's like, I'm punk rock. Like, I believe in the revolution. I trust nothing. I question everything. I doubt everyone. And she goes, but you like everybody. And everybody you meet, you think is beautiful. And then Superman goes, maybe that's the real punk rock. And I like that. I like that the new revolution isn't negative. That the new revolution is naivety. And the new revolution is trusting people and liking people and giving them the benefit of the doubt and welcoming them no matter who they are. Looking past differences and just loving people because that's what Jesus did. And if that's called Pollyanna and naive, so be it. The real revolution, the Jesus revolution, it doesn't doubt. It doesn't mistrust everything and everyone. It doesn't dislike, and it certainly doesn't hate people for their differences. It doesn't assume the worst. It doesn't categorize people into groups. It doesn't turn negativity or cynicism into some strange virtue. It always hopes, and it always loves. It is a simple belief that if you look at Jesus, he can transform and heal everything that poisons us. Amen. Thank you very much.